Welcome to the History Guy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories of lesser-known historical events told by Lance Geiger, also known as the History Guy on YouTube. I'm Josh, your host, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. We tell all kinds of stories about history, from the modern era to the ancient past, so you never know what we're going to talk about next. One thing you can be sure of, it is history that deserves to be remembered. On today's episode, the History Guy tells 3 stories of movie stars and their service during World War II. First, he tells the story of Hedy Lamarr, the beautiful and brilliant film star who had personal connections to the war and patented an idea that has become the basis for lots of modern technology. Then he tells the stories of Douglas Fairbanks Jr. and Eddie Heimberger, famous men who chose to serve in combat roles and performed significant acts of wartime bravery. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
Odds are that you're either watching or you downloaded this video on Wi-Fi. What you may not know is how Navy torpedoes and a collaboration between an experimental musician and a world-famous movie star helped to make that possible. Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler was born in 1915 in Austria, the daughter of a banker and a concert pianist. They were a wealthy family, and she benefited from a good education and finishing school, and she grew up to be a beautiful girl with pitch black hair and skin so porcelain white that her mother called her Snow White. But her father died in the midst of an Austrian financial crisis, and she and her mother were left with a fraction of her family's former wealth, and so she was forced to take work as a script girl at an Austrian film studio. She had always dreamed, it appears, of being a movie star. Well, she started to get small roles in Austrian movies and eventually got a role in an experimental and at the time very scandalous film made by a Czech filmmaker that gained international acclaim and made her a movie star. And that drew the attention of a wealthy, handsome industrialist. And so they married, and she gave up her career. But it was not a happy marriage. He was demanding and controlling and abusive, and worst, he was an ardent Nazi. And so she escaped, first to Paris and then to London. And it was in London in 1937 that, through a connection, she met Louis B. Mayer, the head of the MGM film studio. Enchanted with her beauty, he knew at once that she would be a movie star. It was at Mayer's urging that she changed her last name to Lamarr, named after a beautiful silent film star who had died too young. Hedy Lamarr's first film was called Algiers, co-starring with Charles Boyer and Sigrid Guri, released in 1938. The film was said to be the inspiration for the more famous film Casablanca. The film was a great success, largely due to Lamarr's stunning beauty. She would star in a string of film successes and become known as the most beautiful woman in films. But for a movie star, she was described as being very un-Hollywood. She didn't drink. She didn't enjoy lavish Hollywood parties. She was very intelligent and grew bored with her roles, which just tended to focus on her beauty. She complained that any girl can be glamorous. All you have to do is stand there and look stupid. And so she began to fill her time inventing. She had a drafting table installed in her house, and she filled the room with technical manuals, and she diddled with a lot of different ideas. An improved Kleenex box, a different kind of stoplight, a tablet that when dropped in water would make it taste like Coca-Cola. Reportedly, she collaborated with Howard Hughes on the design of more efficient airplane wings. But it wasn't until 1940, when at a dinner party she met composer George Antheil, that the idea for what would become her most famous invention was formed. They were both interested in inventing and tinkering. Antheil was an experimental composer who pushed the bounds of technology and musical composition. And when you get an experimental composer and a movie star together to talk about inventing, of course, the very first thing that comes to mind is torpedoes. You see, the war was going on in Europe and looked like it would soon involve the United States. And being an ardent anti-Nazi, Hedy Lamarr really wanted to help the war effort. And she actually knew something about munitions because her first husband, the Nazi who abused her, was a manufacturer of military munitions. Her idea was that if a Navy torpedo could be radio controlled, it would be much more effective at sinking ships. But the problem was it was too easy to jam the frequency that would be used to control the torpedo. And the idea that the two of them came up with was that if the torpedo were to shift radio frequencies frequently, then it would be much more difficult to jam the torpedo. But the problem is that required that the torpedo would be shifting frequencies in exact synchronization with the transmitter that was being used to control the torpedo. And that's where George Antheil came in. As an experimental composer, one of the things that he had done was compose a piece that synced together 16-player pianos. And in short, the way that they solved their problem was to use a sheet of paper that had holes in it, very like the roll on a player piano, that would allow the torpedo and the transmitter to shift frequencies in synchronization. Now, it was a brilliant idea, and in 1942 it was granted a patent under the name a Secret Communications System. But the Navy decided not to use it. They thought it would be too bulky to put inside a normal torpedo. And it was classified top secret, so it couldn't get any commercial use. And having given it to the Navy, even if it did, they could never get any financial benefit from it. So they really pretty much forgot about it. Didn't seem to go anywhere. And Hedy Lamarr did get her dream of helping the war effort because as a movie star, she helped to raise millions and millions of dollars selling war bonds. But then, in the 1950s, the Navy decided that it needed to build something called a sounding device. And that would be a buoy that would be dropped from an airplane that would use sonar to find submarines and then radio the information back to the airplane. And what they needed was a way for it to radio that information that could not easily be jammed or intercepted. And so they rediscovered the patent. And those kinds of devices were used, for example, in the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you understand the technology that we're talking about, then you might recognize that it is a very early version of something called spread spectrum communication technology. And it works from the idea that if you broadcast a signal over multiple shifting frequencies, then you can broadcast a much stronger signal with less interference. And it is a key technology that is necessary for things like cell phones, or Wi-Fi, or Bluetooth devices. And while lots of people were involved in the development of this technology, and there's no real evidence that Antheil and Lamarr ever built a working version of their invention, their patent was rediscovered in the 1950s and has been cited many times as part of the development of that technology that is so ubiquitous today. But since the patent had been filed in her real name and not her stage name, people did not recognize Hedy Lamarr's contribution to this important technology until around the 1990s when she started to receive some awards because of the influential patent. And by then, she was in her 80s. Hedy Lamarr's life can be described as being somewhat tragic. Her film career eventually faded, and reportedly she refused a number of roles because she just found it boring. She never quite got past being cast just for her looks. She was involved in some scandals. She was caught shoplifting, had to pay a fine. She later in life tried to revive her film career and revive her looks with plastic surgery, and it did not work out so well, and so she was rarely seen in public for the last 3 decades of her life. And of course, her marvelous invention didn't receive attention until late in life, and she never did see a dime for technology that would be today worth billions. She passed away in the year 2000 at the age of 85, but she leaves behind such a wonderful legacy, the beautiful body of film work that you can still watch today, and she is still one of the most beautiful women in the history of film. And of course, an unquestionable patriotism that allowed her to raise millions of dollars to help to fight the Nazis, and her amazing invention, so far ahead of its time.
Now is the part of the episode where we get to chat with the history guy. A little bit about what we just heard, what we're going to hear, and some behind-the-scenes stuff that you only get to hear about on the podcast. So one of the things I looked into after I listened to this episode, it had been a while since I'd watched it, is I went looking into, because you just mentioned that first movie she was in was controversial, and I went and looked at it, and it's it would be racy probably even today.
It's soft porn today.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly quite a bit of of nudity. I didn't find any actual, but that's apparently what is really controversial about it, is that there was significant sex scenes, and this was one of the first times that had ever really been done. So much so,
it showed
yes,
a female. Yeah,
yes.
I guess we don't have to go into great detail there.
No.
But yeah, and I don't know how many young actresses do something like that. She never seemed to be particularly embarrassed about it.
No.
It was just seen as an art film.
Yeah,
but yeah, it is more racy than if you're thinking, well, how racy could it be? We're talking like the 1930s. Well, yeah, it's
yeah, it's kind of beside the topic of the episode.
It wouldn't get I would get an R rating today,
No.
right? I mean, I don't think we'd
It's
get
not
an X rating today.
wild. We've certainly seen some stuff like, and we see lots of nudity in modern movies. And this one wasn't.
I mean, certainly your film career did not look anything even like a film career today would be in terms of that. So yeah. I don't think it's overly scandalous, but it is interesting that was kind of her start in film, especially since she would become a real actress really later.
Yeah, and at the time, I guess she was happy to have that. Well, there's kind of some talk about whether she knew what she was getting into, and some people are like, oh, she seemed to understand it, where other people, there's all these talk that she didn't realize she was going to be nude. And then they told her that if she didn't do it, that she was going to have to pay for scenes or for the scenes that they'd already shot. But ultimately, the version that it took forever for any version of it to come out in the United States. And I mean, that was a period where they had a board that looked at movies and was like, no, this is against the morals of the country.
So it's interesting that it was called Ecstasy, wasn't it? But
yeah.
I mean that could play in Germany. It couldn't play in the United States.
Couldn't play in the United States. Yeah. So most of the versions
there's a different attitude towards nudity and stuff between Europe and the United States. That might be part of the explanation too. But you hate to see that. You hate to see that representing her career.
Yeah,
though.
that's
true.
true.
The sort of many scandals in her life. I mean, she was actually just an amazing person.
Yeah.
If you went on the CDE side, you could I think maybe a lot of actresses probably had some stuff earlier in the career that they're embarrassed about. But I mean, it was more. I mean, when you look it up, it's kind of more than you expect.
But one of the things that the U.S. was all concerned about was that they wanted it to be really clear that she was divorced before she gets with the second guy, essentially falls in love, because she was married. She was in a passionless marriage, and that's
passionless marriage with a Nazi arms manufacturer.
Yes. And so that they're like, oh, it's got to be really clear that she's divorced before.
And it's interesting to talk about that scandal too. Also made her change her name. And, I mean, a lot of that. I mean, I think you could probably find that in a lot of the history of a performer, and kind of interesting how. And I mean, in some way, I mean, she came to the United States. She didn't barely speak English. She'd been taught how to do an American accent for a play, but I mean, how well she spoke English, I don't know. By all accounts, I mean, she was just absolutely brilliant. And she's one of those people like today. You'll find out they come over and they taught themselves English watching MacGyver or something.
It's incredible. I mean, just that at this basic level that she was essentially, she had almost nothing, and she came to the United States running away from this marriage, and that she was able to. She did that of her, with her own resources and her own brain.
Well, just getting on the boat with Louis B. Mayer and just kind of going and getting in his face, and then becomes a movie star. I mean, this really did. I mean, I can't say that I was really familiar with Hedy Lamarr. I mean, she's a little bit. I'm an old fart, but I mean, she's a little bit before my time, and it really gets you to appreciate what an absolutely extraordinary individual that she was. And then when you end up tying that to her inventions and her passion for invention was kind of funny. She joked about some of her, like a tablet you'd throw in water and would turn it into Coca-Cola. It was essentially Alka-Seltzer, and she's like, I imagine it tasted horrible. But I mean, she just she was a woman of many passions, and she, I mean, the obstacles she overcame to get where she was are really quite extraordinary. And that starts with doing what I think, taking the first acting role that she could take. She went from a script girl to very desperately wanting to be in film. Yeah.
And it's certainly, I mean, it's clear, that she was stunning. She was very beautiful. But it's amazing how she had to kind of battle that her whole life, because
I mean, because she didn't want to be, she was offering roles, she thought she was getting roles just because of her appearance, and finally she just kind of got bored with that. And there was actually another interesting scandal where someone had used a Photoshop of her early on, not a Photoshop, like a line drawing of her, and she sued for her, because she had the rights to her image, and she protected that until the end. I mean, the sadder scandal at the end is that she was barely seen in public for the last 30 years of her life, and that's certainly tragic. But it is. I mean, she was an amazing person, and she just got bored with just being the pretty girl on screen.
And she turned that into, because it's not really clear exactly what inspired her to invent, other than she just wanted to challenge herself.
She was just always so, that, like her work with Howard Hughes was she was looking at birds' wings, and then they started talking about that somewhere, and then so she actually talked to him about design of airplane wings, which is really interesting. But yeah, the collaboration with Anthiel, I mean, clearly they just had a conversation where they had kind of a similar interest, and the idea is, well, we could, the idea you'd use the same way that you synchronize player pianos, to use that to synchronize, torpedoes, is really a fascinating idea. But, you can imagine, I mean, at least I can imagine sitting around and just, shooting the breeze with some friends and coming up with an idea and like, yeah, we should really do this.
Yeah.
But I mean, the thing is, she really did, and actually went and filed the patent. And that's something that most of us wouldn't necessarily do, is take that idea and carry it to that step forward.
Oh, and she was really, I mean, she clearly really wanted to help with the war effort, and she was she had, there were so many ways that she could do that, and she attempted with
she
everything
did, yeah.
she
She
had.
had a lot of great videos and stuff of her, of movies of her participate with the Bond drives and stuff like that. And of course, everybody in Hollywood was doing that at the time, but she was clearly quite passionate about it. And I don't know if that's somebody like Marlene Dietrich, that clearly she put a lot of effort into the war effort because she had a German heritage, and she knew that could hurt her career, and so she had to be super patriotic. I don't know if Hedy Lamarr had to behave the same way, because I'm not sure that people perceived that Hedy Lamarr, who had changed her name and didn't carry the German accent, was in the same position. But what I do know is that it's quite clear, if you go back and research it, that she was one of those that was fully involved in the fundraising of the war bonds, and she really did try to make a difference. It's interesting because the technology that she and Anthiel invented didn't make a difference in the war, and she'd kind of forgotten about it by the time that it was important. But there has been some pushback on this episode, because if you look online now, and I swear, when I made this is one of my early videos, that I didn't find this stuff then. But if you look online now, there's quite a lot talking about this. It's become more mainstream.
Yeah.
But you'll see people like, Hedy Lamarr invented the internet, and that's hogwash. I mean, they were using literally piano player wire, right? I mean, for the people then that'll push back, and I guess some people think that she's stealing credit away from Tesla or whatever. When you look at the development of that spread spectrum communication, which is really, really a critical technology to Bluetooth and cell phones and stuff like that you can keep a consistent signal by frequency hopping. What you find is that patent is identified, is cited many, 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 many times. Yeah. To the point to say that it is clearly an important technology. The idea that they came up with was clearly part of what developed it. You can't say that she invented cell phones or the internet or anything like that. That wasn't even what they were trying to do. We don't even know if there was ever a working piece of their device made, anything like that. What you can say is that the idea was clearly a part of the development process, and an important enough part of the development process that it's cited many times by others who are making further developments. And that's absolutely extraordinary. From someone whose complaint was they're just putting her on film because she's so purty, right? I mean, she was clearly clearly absolutely brilliant, but also just the sort of person that was able to act on that. It was a
brilliant basic conceptual idea of how this would work, and it was
they were saying, how do we not interfere with driving the torpedo? But I mean, how could they have conceived that later the idea was going to be how do we do all this sort of radio communication in a way that you can have the whole world talking to each other, which is, I mean, we all joke now that our teacher said you wouldn't have a calculator with you whenever you went. You're like, you're wrong. But I mean that's made possible by someone who came up with the idea. Said what you've got to do is hop around multiple frequencies, so that if something's interfering with the frequency, you go to another spectrum. And that's that the whole idea seems kind of comical, that you're going to have a piece of paper running inside that torpedo.
Ultimately, you can see why the Navy was like, but conceptually,
I bet you they had a lot of stuff.
Oh yeah,
but I mean, also too, I mean, they made no effort to profit from that. They never even thought of trying to profit from that. They came up with it. They wrote the patent, and they just gave that straight to the Navy because they thought it would help. So I mean, I think however you put it, it's an extraordinary story. I mean, if people want to complain that, and I do think that some of the stories you see on the internet overstate what the technology meant. But however they want to complain about that, I'd say, well, what have you done? Because I mean, they really did think this up. They really did put this together, and that patent really did become something that other people springboard off of to create really important technologies. And it ended up being useful to the Navy because it cited quite a lot in the use of those sonar buoys that they used. We mentioned they used that during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
It's certainly, I mean, I think it's a good example, and kind of one of the ways it connects to some of the other topics we're discussing today is that it is an unexpected way and place for someone to have tried to assist in the war effort and to have
Yeah.
played a role, and ultimately played an important role in history. Even if it, I mean, I
Yeah.
think we don't expect those kinds of things, and I think that there are a lot of people in the world who have parts of them that we don't necessarily see. And Hedy Lamarr was one of these people who had
It
a
is.
very
Yeah.
clear public image, and there was so much more to her that
Yeah.
wasn't as clear.
But I mean, we talk about the greatest generation, and the reason
Yeah,
we talk about that is because, I mean, among all these other things, her talent, her undeniable beauty, and her undeniable intelligence, is that she was truly willing to make sacrifices,
yeah,
and to do that because she believed in the cause. And that's extraordinary. I mean, that if they had tried to benefit from that patent economically, given all the places that it's been cited,
yeah,
then the two of them would have made quite a lot of wealth out of it. They never seemed to even think, and didn't even seem to occur to them that if this had commercial application, that they wanted to claim that commercial application. That's a level of sacrifice. But I mean, she truly, I mean. When we talk about those today, they always say, like, would movie stars do that today? And I honestly, I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting counterfactual. I mean, but the level of self-sacrifice made by the Hollywood elite during the Second World War was really extraordinary. And I mean, they gave up years of their career. They took their public image, which was extremely valuable to them, and they gave that as a public entity to raise war bonds and I mean, it's the amazing level of sacrifice. And of course, that's the theme of the podcast today. But this level of sacrifice by people who they were in a position where they didn't have to sacrifice anything, and but they did because they believed in the cause. And I think she's a great example of that. And honestly, I mean, just the research on this episode, just really what it taught me is that she was an absolutely amazing person, just a person that was a true, a Renaissance, person who had so many talents and so much ability. And you would not have thought, if you've watched any of her films, you wouldn't have thought that she came here barely speaking English, or that even that she was accented. I do have one apology for this one, because someone had mentioned it before in her first movie. It's Charles Boyer. He pronounced it Boyer, not Boyer. Excuse me for making that mistake. But I mean, it was kind of delightful going back and watching some of her films too, because they kind of before my time, and she was really quite a brilliant actress, both in dramatic roles and in sort of the rom-com sort of roles.
Yeah, and I think it's worth talking about her, and it's a good way to kind of see how things were different in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, to some extent, you could say that we've not faced a challenge quite like World War II since. And so, but I mean, you do understand why we do call them the greatest generation. I mean, I think I understand that.
What they did. Well, and I don't think many people realized at the time, but I mean, she had literally escaped Germany.
Yeah.
And had literally been married in a loveless marriage to a Nazi arms manufacturer. So I mean, she probably understood that so much more than anybody really realized at the time, and she made her contribution. I mean, both in terms of the war bomb drives, but in terms of, I mean, she applied her brilliant mind as the real thought towards, this is a cause that I got to contribute to, and then wasn't recognized for so long because she did it under her real name and not under that assumed name that Louis B. Mayer told her to take.
So if you are a listener or a watcher of The History Guy on YouTube, you know that there are ways to support us. One of the best ways to support us and keep us making these episodes of Forgotten History and producing this podcast is by becoming a patron on Patreon. There are some ways that if we give you little tchotchkes and stuff, you can get challenge coins.
Oh, the very cool History Guy challenge coin.
Yeah, it's very cool.
And all the way up to the bow tie, which I will sign for you if you wish. But it really is, if you love history, if you love forgotten history, if you like the History Guy, this is not easy. This is our day job.
Yeah.
This is what there's three of us that are full time with the company now, and so even if it's $3 or whatever a month, if you go to www.patreon.com, the History Guy, and sometimes you'll get videos earlier. You certainly get those tchotchkes, but what you really get is the ability to use just however much you can afford
to help us continue to produce these stories of forgotten history that are, I think history deserves to be remembered.
It takes time for us to interlibrary loan books and do all of this research, and that's what you keep us doing, which I think is really worth it.
Well, and between the three of us, we have, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 cats to feed.
Yeah, gotta feed the cats, you guys, and we really appreciate it because you are making it possible for my cats to be just so fat.
Yes. We don't want to claim they're overfed, but yeah.
I swear I don't overfeed them. They overfeed themselves.
Yes. Yeah, I think the vet said once of Lucky Star said, waste absent.
Waste absent.
Absent. She couldn't hold up her pants if we gave her.
So we really appreciate, being able to do what we do. We also, I think we all really enjoy our job, and I like being able to talk about these stories and tell forgotten tales. And some of them, it's interesting.
If you enjoy these, this is a great way for you to help us out, continue to keep making these episodes.
And we really appreciate it. Next up, the History Guy tells the stories of Douglas Fairbanks Jr. and Eddie Heimberger.
If you're a fan of history, then you probably know what D-Day was, the Allied invasion of German-occupied France on the Normandy beaches in June of 1944. But many people don't know that D-Day was actually intended to coincide with another invasion of southern France in what was called Operation Anvil. And because of various problems, largely because the war wasn't progressing as quickly as we thought it would in Italy, that operation had to be put off until August of 1944. But in August of 1944, there was essentially a second D-Day called Operation Dragoon that involved more than 500,000 Allied troops. And it is nearly forgotten next to the larger D-Day invasions. And that's too bad because it was really a very successful operation. Operation Dragoon liberated southern France, captured or killed more than 150,000 German troops, and most importantly, opened up the French ports of Marseille and Toulouse for Allied supply, all in a period of just about 4 weeks for a loss of about 20,000 Allied casualties. And like Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, Operation Dragoon had a number of interesting stories that could be told, but one really stands out, not just because it represents an operation that really changed the nature of warfare, but because the person at the center of that operation was a very famous person who had starred in more than 50 major Hollywood films. Lots of movie stars saw service in the Second World War, but few saw service as interesting as that of movie star Douglas Fairbanks Jr. And it is a story that deserves to be remembered. Douglas Fairbanks is one of the first true movie icons, starring in adventure roles in the silent films period, playing characters like Zorro, Robin Hood, and Don Juan. He was so famous in the silent film era that he was often called the King of Hollywood, and hosted the first Academy Awards in 1929. Douglas Fairbanks married his first wife, Anna Beth Sully, in 1907, and in 1909 they had a son, whom they also named Douglas. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. would be his father's only child from his first marriage. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. got his first film contract with Paramount Pictures at the age of 14, largely due to his father's famous name. He went into motion pictures against his father's wishes, later explaining that, "I did it for the money. When my parents separated, it was hardly amicable, and Mother and I needed to eat. Movie companies were willing to exploit my famous name. I didn't really understand that at the time." His first film role was in the movie Steven Steps Out in 1923. He played many successful roles in the latter part of the silent film period, starring alongside stars like Greta Garbo and John Gilbert, and briefly marrying fellow movie star Joan Crawford. Unlike his father, he successfully made the transition to talkies, and starred in a slew of successful films, both in romantic comedies and swashbuckling adventure roles, with his biggest hit co-starring with Cary Grant and Victor McLaglen in Gunga Din in 1939. As war loomed on the horizon, he enlisted in the U.S. Naval Reserve in 1940, alongside fellow movie star Robert Montgomery. He was commissioned a lieutenant, junior grade, in the U.S. Navy Reserve in 1940. In an interview in 1993, he said, "My theatrical career was fairly flourishing at the time, but I wanted to go into the reserves and take on Adolf Hitler." Many stars served in the military in the Second World War, with some fighting in combat. Actor Jimmy Stewart commanded a bomber squadron flying combat missions for the U.S. Army Air Force, and eventually made the rank of Brigadier General in the Air Force Reserve. Actor Clark Gable likewise flew combat missions with the Army Air Force. But Douglas Fairbanks Jr. was one of the few who chose to keep a low profile and not to seek special treatment due to his fame. He served aboard a number of Navy ships, including the battleship USS Washington, heavy cruiser USS Wichita, and aircraft carrier USS Wasp, seeing combat in the North Atlantic against German U-boats. In 1942, he was given a temporary duty assignment in England with the Combined Operations Commando Headquarters under Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. This was the sort of temporary duty exchange where an Allied officer is expected to observe Allied training and tactics. But Fairbanks decided that he would go through full commando training and ended up participating in a number of cross-channel commando raids. There he developed an appreciation for the military art of deception. When his duty assignment returned him to the United States, the brash lieutenant made a pitch to his commanding officer, Admiral Kent Hewitt, and then to Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest Young, to create a U.S. naval unit specializing in tactical cover, diversionary, and deception operations. His idea would come to life as the U.S. Navy Beach Jumpers program. Authorized in 1943, the program called for the recruitment of 180 officers and 300 men who had met 4 basic requirements: no seasickness, experience handling small boats, enough understanding of electronics to fix a home radio, and a basic understanding of celestial navigation. The Navy advertised, "We are seeking volunteers for prolonged, hazardous, distant duty for a secret project." The beach jumpers were assigned 63-foot air-sea rescue boats, each with a crew of 1 officer and 6 crew. The small plywood-hulled boats were armed with twin 50 caliber machine guns, rocket tubes, and electronics deception equipment and gear. The beach jumpers' job was to confuse the enemy into thinking that an amphibious landing was coming far away from where the real landing was going to be. Using smoke, projected sound, rocket attacks, and balloons that gave a radar signature that looked like much larger ships, the beach jumpers with just a few small boats could convince the enemy that they were facing a full-scale invasion. First used in the invasion of Sicily in 1943, the beach jumpers sowed so much confusion among the enemy that the real landing accomplished almost complete surprise. While he was not senior enough officer to actually command the beach jumpers program, Fairbanks was given command roles that had him involved in nearly every layer of training and planning for beach jumper operations. He earned a Silver Star for leading a group of beach jumpers in the invasion of Italy. For Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France in 1944, Fairbanks was given command of a beach jumpers unit assigned to simulate an invasion in the area of Nice-Cannes, 100 kilometers from the actual landing. It was during that operation that the largest naval engagement of Operation Dragoon occurred, when one of Fairbanks' small boats accidentally ran into 2 much larger and more heavily armed German corvettes. Fairbanks rushed in the rest of his small boats and, deftly using their rockets, managed to sink both corvettes, and then to direct the operation to rescue their crews. For the action, Fairbanks was awarded the Legion of Merit, and the beach jumpers were awarded a Presidential Unit Citation. Their efforts were considered to be instrumental in the success of Operation Dragoon. The beach jumpers continued their operations throughout the Second World War in both the Mediterranean and in the Pacific, where they performed another important diversionary operation during the Battle of Luzon in 1945. They were deactivated after the Second World War, but were reactivated again for both the Korean conflict and the Vietnam War, where they also engaged in PSYOPs, or psychological operations. One of the beach jumper units in Vietnam was awarded the Navy Unit Commendation. While their role has changed over time, they still exist today as the Navy's Fleet Tactical Deception Group. There are a number of stories for how they got the name beach jumpers, including one that said that it was a play on the word bejeebus because they were supposed to scare the bejeebus out of the enemy. But in 1993, Douglas Fairbanks Jr. put an end to that speculation and said that it was just a cover name that Lord Mountbatten made up. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. continued to serve throughout the war and was in fact planning beach jumper operations to support the planned British invasion of Singapore when the war ended. He continued to serve in the Naval Reserve and retired as a full captain in 1954. In 1993, he wrote a memoir about his experiences in the Second World War called A Hell of a War. After the war, he tried to revive his film career, and he played Sinbad opposite Maureen O'Hara, but he never quite achieved the same level of success that he had before the war. Still, he continued to perform on stage, on television, and in movies, and his last full-length feature role was in the movie Ghost Story in 1981. He passed away in the year 2000 at the age of 90. And despite a life that had earned him so much fame that he had not one but 3 stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, in 1993, when he was asked how he ranked his military career in the context of his extraordinary life, his answer was, very high indeed.
Now the history guy tells the story of Eddie Heimberger and the invasion of Tarawa.
Edward Heimberger first started serving the United States as a clown. Traveling with a circus in Mexico, he was able to spy the comings and goings of German U-boats in Mexican ports in the run-up to the Second World War, reporting to U.S. Army intelligence. He enlisted in the Navy in 1942, but was discharged in order to take a commission as an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve, serving aboard the Ormsby-class attack transport USS Sheridan. It was as a lieutenant junior grade aboard the Sheridan that he went to the bloody Battle of Tarawa. Tarawa is an atoll, a ring-shaped coral reef, some 2,400 miles southwest of Pearl Harbor, now part of the island nation of Kiribati. Part of the Gilbert Islands chain, Tarawa had been occupied by the Japanese in December of 1941. The atoll was part of the U.S. island hopping strategy. To take the important Mariana Islands, U.S. planners had determined that the U.S. must first take the Marshall Islands. But the Japanese garrison at Tarawa straddled U.S. communication lines between the Marshall Islands and the U.S. Pacific headquarters at Pearl Harbor. Thus, Tarawa was a critical start to the Marianas campaign. The Japanese defense was centered on the island of Besio on the extreme southwest side of the atoll. While only slightly larger than a half square mile, Besio is the largest island in South Tarawa and included an airfield. Tarawa's 4,500 Japanese defenders, including some 1,200 engineers, had nearly a year to prepare defenses and were well equipped. The defenses included 14 large-caliber coastal defense guns, 40 artillery pieces, a dozen Type 95 tanks, and over 500 fortified pillboxes, covering an island only approximately 2 miles long. At Tarawa, the 18,000 Marines of the 2nd Marine Division would be facing the first serious Japanese opposition to an amphibious landing, and an entrenched enemy prepared to fight virtually to the last man. Tarawa was a particularly vicious battle against a fanatically determined enemy. The 2nd Marine Division took over 3,100 casualties, killed and wounded, while another 687 U.S. Navy personnel died when the escort carrier USS Liscombe Bay was sunk by a torpedo. While the United States had taken nearly 4 times as many casualties on Guadalcanal, those had been spread out over a 5-month campaign, while almost all of the Tarawa casualties had been inflicted in just 72 hours. The U.S. public was shocked at the number of casualties taken such a small, remote, and seemingly unimportant island. The numbers were even more shocking for the Japanese garrison. Of the 3,600 men of the Japanese military garrison, only 1 officer and 16 men surrendered. The Japanese had fought nearly to the last man. The USS Sheridan, with a complement of some 520 officers and men, carried approximately 1,500 U.S. Marines, who would embark largely on the ship's 22 LCVPs, or Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel. The LCVP, commonly called a Higgins boat, was constructed largely of plywood. With a crew of 4, the boats could carry 36 troops, or about 1 platoon. The 36-foot boats carried 2 30-caliber machine guns and could make about 12 knots. In the first assault on Tarawa, the Sheridan's LCVPs carried 8 Marine assault teams in 4 waves. In addition to the boats carrying troops, 1 LCVP was assigned as a control boat to the boat group commander, responsible for directing the operations of the landing waves. And an additional LCVP was assigned as the salvage boat, which aided the control boat and was responsible for evacuating wounded. Lieutenant Heimberger commanded the salvage boat, Boat 13. Heimberger worked through the first day assisting the control boat in recovering damaged LCVPs. But the next day his boat came upon 150 Marines who were pinned, waist-deep in water, being strafed by machine guns and snipers. The invasion plans had assumed that the high tide would provide approximately 5 feet of water over the coral reefs, plenty of draft for a Higgins boat. But the day of the invasion, the ocean experienced a neap tide, the tide that occurs at the point where the solar tide cancels out the lunar tide. In short, the tide didn't rise, and the Higgins boats could not approach the shore. Hundreds of Marines were discharged in the water hundreds of yards from shore, forced to wade through waist or chest deep water under fire. These Marines had walked into a death trap, triple crossfire from hidden machine gun nests and snipers. Almost 100 of the 150 Marines were already wounded. With no other shallow boats available, Heimberger in the salvage boat, along with the command boat, took it upon themselves to rescue the men. Under fire, they began collecting and evacuating the wounded. Eventually, Boat 13's propeller was damaged on the reef, and Heimberger took control of another LCVP. On the return, the Japanese fire had increased, and the Marines were struggling as the tide was coming in. It became clear that the men needed to be evacuated more quickly. Heimberger collected more LCVPs with the idea of collecting all the men in one trip, but the enemy fire was so strong that instead he decided to have the 3 boats use their machine guns to suppress the enemy fire, while the 4th evacuated casualties. Still, as his boat collected wounded, they had to stop for a moment to silence a particularly persistent sniper with their .30 caliber machine guns. The fire was intense, with particular risk of incendiary ammunition igniting the fuel drums aboard the LCVP. The men in the boat were stomping upon the burning rounds inside the boat to try to prevent their igniting the fuel. Because of the actions that Heimberger took upon himself, he and his boat personally rescued 47 wounded Marines, and he supervised the rescue of 30 more. For his bravery, subjecting himself to fire to rescue others, he was awarded the Bronze Star with Combat V, an award to recognize individuals for heroic achievement while exposed to personal hazard during direct participation in combat operations. It was a fitting award for a man who did not have to expose himself to enemy fire, but took it upon himself to do so to rescue his comrades. And it is even more impressive in that Edward Heimberger had had such an established acting career before the war, having had starring roles in 17 feature films, including the popular Brother Rat films alongside Ronald Reagan and Jane Wyman, as well as a slew of Broadway and television appearances filmed before he entered the service, that he could easily have chosen a position that would never have put him anywhere near enemy fire. Early in his career, Heimberger had stopped using his last name for his acting credits because people kept mispronouncing it Hamburger. Instead, Edward Albert Heimberger used his middle name, and Eddie Albert went on to have a stunning more than 50-year acting career that included hundreds of film credits, 2 Oscar nominations for 1953's Roman Holiday and 1972's The Heartbreak Kid, and numerous TV roles, including, of course, perhaps his most famous, as attorney Oliver Wendell Douglas opposite Ava Gabor's Lisa in the beloved sitcom Green Acres. Towards the end of his long and distinguished acting career, Eddie Albert was asked in an interview of which of his many hundreds of film and theater roles he was most proud. After thinking it over for a moment, he said, "I'm not proud of any of the acting. I am most proud of that day at Tarawa." Edward Albert Heimberger, a hero of the Battle of Tarawa, passed away in 2005, the age of 99.
So, all 3 of the episodes we're talking about today are really about these famous people who made contributions to the war effort, but also just sacrificed to do so, and really made an effort. And when you look at Hedy Lamarr with just her personal relationship with some of the pieces of the war, Douglas Fairbanks is in a very different position, but similar to
you're right, junior.
It
is junior, because there were 2 double Douglas Fairbanks. I mean, his only history is interesting too, because his dad, abandoned him and his mother, and he is making a career because his dad's name's famous, which he says, I didn't really like that, but we had to eat. He is one of those. He was a big star when the war started, and one of those who easily could have avoided the war altogether. Even by age, could have avoided the war altogether, but also could have easily gone into one of the film units and made training films and stuff. And that's not to denigrate any of those people that were doing it. A lot of them were, but I mean, this is a guy that he had to go through specific effort in order to be put into just the straight up, regular combat role. And actually, both the studio and the military were generally kind of opposed to that. He kind of had to hide who he was in order to go do what he was doing, and he put himself in real risk, and that makes it an interesting story. But it's also interesting what he did, because the unit that he kind of helped create is one I don't think people are generally familiar with. It is really
wildly
an extraordinary
unique,
unit.
Right? It's a really unique thing that he did, and you're right, is that this was a guy who certainly did not have to work as hard to do what he did. I mean, gosh,
and did not have to put himself physically at risk in the way that he did.
Yeah, right. And it's we don't want to say it's not just that he was a famous guy who decided to put on the uniform and go serve. That's not just what makes it remarkable. He was I mean, his service was remarkable for how he served. Quite apart from the fact that he was this famous movie star, and you wonder if we'd see anything. It's hard to imagine a lot of Hollywood stars doing that today. But like we mentioned in the last one, I guess we also haven't really seen quite the same level of war or challenge. And kind of
it is, but I mean, Prince Harry went and served in Afghanistan, and he had to keep an assumed name to do that. And they finally pulled him out when that became revealed in the press because it could be too much of a propaganda victory. So there were that was the king's son was also participating in the Second World War too, and under an assumed name, because if they knew what ship he was on, it could be a real problem. But so I mean, it still does happen today.
That's true.
There's various stories, but. On this level, I don't know. But I mean, what you can say is that it is very laudable. It's heroic that he chose to go and put himself at risk when he didn't have to. But that's not the only compelling part about this story.
No.
Because if Douglas Fairbanks Jr. deserves really a biopic, I really do think that. But I mean, good golly, the Beach Jumpers deserve a movie because it's just such a good story,
right? And he really seems to have gone in and he pushed for every piece of this. Not only was he like, okay, I'm gonna, I want to go in and I want to serve. I don't want special treatment. I want to serve in combat roles. But then he's also he learns.
He went trained with the commandos. Yeah,
and he's like, I'm gonna train with these commandos, and then I want to I'm gonna go push for. Not only am I gonna go push for a unit like that, I want to be a part of that unit.
I want to be a part of it. Yeah, he just wasn't quite senior enough to command it, or he might have. But it's very clear that this was not. This is not just claiming credit.
Yeah.
That he was really instrumental in the creation of the Beach Jumpers, and that their role was successful.
Yeah.
And there's other, I mean, certainly on land, and we've probably heard about, the different kind of psychological operations and stuff like that to confuse, the enemy about where we were going, and to confuse them about whether, they've got the whole, fake army in England to make them think that we're going to invade Norway. But I mean, this is its own unique take on that, and that you could just take out these little bitty vessels, and that you could create enough chatter with those to make them think that the invasion fleet had arrived, in another place. And then think about what that means, because they're going to target.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot more guns pointing at you than you've got.
And you're out there in your little boat full of antennas and a couple of machine guns, and they did that, And
it's impressive, and it's a good idea that they literally are just like small unit, lots of firepower, but not necessarily, they're not necessarily looking for someone that, they're like, oh, you're going to take out tanks. Like, you really just need to make a lot of noise.
and become the target for that. Yeah.
That's frightening.
We still, they do that today. I mean, we have planes, wild weasel planes and stuff like that are intended to, but I mean, you draw the fire. That's crazy. And, there in southern France, they actually, were attacked by German corvettes, which are real warships.
That's crazy.
Small,
corvettes are small, but could you imagine?
Yeah, they just were so aggressive that these Germans were absolutely unprepared, and they sunk them. I mean, they sank them both.
Wild.
Even though they were really outgunned, except that they, so it wasn't. I mean, it's a really cool role all around what the Beach Jumpers were doing. But when it came to combat, that's a movie. That is an action movie. Him taking those two boats into combat, sinking those two German vessels.
That's an incredible story. That fight, and because you're right. I mean, you're like, oh, corvettes. I mean, sure, they're small. It wouldn't have been much of a naval fight, except for the fact that they were fighting.
They couldn't take on a destroyer.
Yeah,
but
they were fighting tiny boats. They were
essentially. They asked for people who could operate a motorboat and a radio, and that was the Beach Jumpers. Yeah.
And it's awfully brave, that when they hire people in, they're like, oh, you're going to have prolonged, hazardous, distant duty for a special project, and like this was crazy. And one of the people that did that was this very famous movie star. Yeah, who certainly didn't have to participate. Even if he's the guy who came up with the idea, he didn't have to go in.
Yeah, he didn't have to. Yeah, well, I mean, and he never would have had to have done that. And he made true sacrifice too, and that his career never was quite the same afterwards. And I mean, he's one of those that kind of gave a good chunk of what would have been a very lucrative career to fighting the war. And thank heavens he didn't give more than I think because he was really truly in danger. but I mean, he was willing to put his life at risk like anybody else, and didn't seem to care that he was a movie star in doing that.
And certainly, I mean,
still, I mean, right up to the end of the war. I mean, they were planning the next invasion, and he was getting ready to
they were fairly fortunate in that the actions they did take, they didn't take bad casualties, but gosh, they certainly could have, because their whole job is to go poke the hornet's nest and literally just do your very best to keep the hornets looking at you, and you're only a handful of guys in some small boats. I mean, it's really easy for that to turn bad.
It takes a lot of guts to try to make your rowboat look like a battleship. Yeah, because they're going to shoot that with the things they use to shoot at battleships, right? Yeah.
Which could be a problem for you on your little boat, and it's just incredible that they were willing to do that. And it is amazing.
It's a good story.
Oh,
it's
gosh,
crazy.
yeah.
It's got. I mean, there's even some humor into how they were doing it and how they were. And I mean, it is really just a compelling story. And that someone sat around and said, "Hey, we should do this."
Yeah.
And then that someone happens to be someone that's notable, that's taking risk he doesn't need to make. So I mean, in my book, he's definitely a hero, and that he definitely made sacrifices in very heroic ways that had really impact.
I think his efforts and his service was remarkable, even if you ignored his who he was. Yeah. And I think the beach jumpers were an incredible group of people. Even if you didn't talk about who. That this was a famous guy who was serving with them. That was some crazy stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. And that show, because like so many of the Greatest Generation, later in life when they were asking what he was proud of, it wasn't his film career. It was his career. What he did in the Second World War.
Yeah.
And it truly saved. The other thing about it is it truly saved lives. Yeah. What it really did is it preserved the lives of other soldiers, sailors, airmen whose lives were at risk, and he was pulling the fire away from them.
Because the most dangerous part of those landings is the actual initial landing, we learned at Anzio that's not the only dangerous part, but certainly that's when you're at your most vulnerable, is when you were trying to get from the water to the beach. And
every single enemy soldier that you kept away from the point of attack saved lives.
Absolutely,
and that's what they were doing.
Yeah. Yeah, because those landings could be absolute bloodbaths, and so you just got to keep everything you can away from them, and it's a significant sacrifice too, because that those guys are still shooting at you. It's not, you're not just you're keeping them busy, but they could still kill you, and gosh, it would be easy for them to blow up your boat and then turn around and go deal with the thing if you don't do it long enough.
If you fail, then that can mean that they're going to have that much more. Yeah. Could have impacted the entire invasion.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's a lot of weight to carry when you're just a few men on a small boat. Yeah.
Yeah. And I did think it was just as an interesting note, he died the same year as Hedy Lamarr, which I thought was just
that is
coincidence, but it's
we're losing that generation. I mean, we're losing that generation.
It's just within my lifetime, we had there were World War I people still alive, and now veterans, and now there's not. I don't think there's any World War I veterans still alive.
Certainly in my lifetime. I mean,
the
World War, when I was a child, the World War I veterans were my age.
Yeah.
And I knew him, and it didn't even occur to me that that whole generation is just going to go.
And now we see that, and I think it's important to preserve as many of those stories as we can.
Absolutely.
And this isn't a story.
It's not to say because they were famous that people like Hedy Lamarr and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. contributed more. Yeah. But I mean, they certainly brought a light to the cause and showed what everybody sacrificed in that time.
Yeah. Well, and certainly, I mean, all those other beach jumpers, their story deserves to be remembered too.
It does, yeah. If Hollywood's listening, and that's happened, there's been a few where we made an episode and then a movie appeared somewhere, so I'll take credit for it. But I mean, if Hollywood's listening, man, the beach jumpers would make an awesome movie. It really would. Yeah.
Wild. It's absolutely amazing story. And then we have this other episode and it's.
Talk about small men on a boat.
You talk about small men.
Men on a small boat. Men on a small boat.
Another story, and in so many ways very similar to how Douglas Fairbanks Jr. did this, is that Edward Heimberger didn't have to do this, and
he sincerely was in the sort of part. Matter of fact, he was offered to be able to go into the Ford's film group. And so he could have been making, training films and stuff like that. No one would have thought any of the less of him already. And he'd already, as a clown, had been spying for the Navy. That was kind of interesting, too.
That opening is wild, that he was spying as a clown. Talk about someone who really wanted to get involved in doing something for his country. He was willing to...
Well, originally just signed up to be just a sailor in the Navy and it moved into the reserve because he could be an officer. But his story is really extraordinary, too. I should mention here, sometimes it's difficult as a producer. The pronunciation is, every time you do something,
Good heavens.
So one of those is the island of Tarawa or Tarawa. Actually, there's pronunciation guides for both, and that's created quite a lot of controversy. Yeah. So all I'm going to say is I did my best, but I kind of wish I'd gone with Tarawa because Tarawa is hard to do. Hard for me to. It really is rough out here. But who knew that this guy, who was a very famous actor, who easily could have avoided any sort of combat role, would wind up at this bloody battle of Tarawa and engage in such heroic activity during that battle.
And this is a battle that honestly, it's not one people talk about, and but it is in so many ways, very illustrative of these fights in the Pacific.
Well, it was a battle that really shocked the nation. Because of the film, a film was made of it with the Marines at Tarawa, and that's the first time people really saw, what was being sacrificed. They really saw the level of, the bodies floating in the water.
And this is a tiny little island.
Oh, tiny little atoll, and it's one of those where it's really questionable whether this invasion was necessary, whether we really had to have a Tarawa, and were we really just experimenting with what we could do with amphibious invasion? But Guadalcanal was such a bloody fight, but the invasion itself, the landing was not heavily opposed. Yeah. Tarawa was the first time that we're really sending them into the jaws of death. And of course, we didn't predict the neap tide correctly, and so they couldn't get them. They're walking in on the coral, and it was a terrible because
we've talked about we did an episode on the machine that NOAA had that predicted tides, the tide predicting machine. And so if they'd had all the right information, I'm sure we could have predicted that. But if you're missing one piece,
the neap tides are rare, and someone just mispredicted that. And it meant for huge casualties.
But that's
in the middle of this, you have this officer he's just an LJG. He's not a high-ranking officer or anything like that. He's commanding a boat that's one of a support boat for boats that are landing people. They've got a few of them. These things are made out of plywood.
They're not.
As vessels of war, they got some machine guns tied to a wooden boat, a light boat, and when he sees things going south in this invasion, he sees people dying. He takes extraordinary command in terms of just dealing with the situation as it goes, and in ways that's not necessarily what you're trained to do. They weren't necessarily following procedure; they were responding to the situation. It's really, really an extraordinary story. When you get into the meat of this, where they've got Marines that are trapped, they're under fire, machine gun fire, sniper fire. You can barely get your boats up to them. You're under fire. One of his boats gets damaged. He just goes and finds another boat. He goes collects boats that are coming back because we have an emergency. When it gets cut off, then they change strategy and they're using machine guns to suppress fire because that's doing better than trying to put it. And in the end, they say things like, these boats are not built for taking casualties out of the water, and we learn those lessons. And, that officer would be, I think, an extraordinary officer in any standard. And largely forgotten. He received a Bronze Star with a Combat B, which that's far more than I ever did, but that's not exactly a high,
Well, think about how many people have received Bronze Stars and we don't know their stories.
In the war, tens of thousands in the war,
right?
And we don't know their stories. And so this story is a really cool story as it is. That officer was an officer that really deserves to be mentioned, even if you didn't know in any way who.
He just so happens to be a famous movie star as well.
Turns out to be a famous movie and television star that probably most of everybody from my generation knows who he is because of Green Acres, for heaven's sakes. But Green Acres is the place to be. But I don't know if you've ever seen Green Acres, but I've seen a lot of Green Acres, that's just a coincidence. That means that we are able to see this extraordinary story of just one guy in the war on one day who made a real difference, and put himself at risk, but just made a real difference to save other people's lives, and that's a great story. That would be a great story even if it didn't turn out to be.
This
Eddie Albert.
This would have been. This is a story that you're absolutely right. He threw himself into danger when the danger, he loses his boat and he chooses to go back and to continue to really push to continue to save those lives. There's a lot of places that's heroism, right? Is that
It
these are
is,
people who,
yeah.
I mean, those Marines were trapped, and I mean, they were just getting chewed up. They
Yeah,
didn't
they
stand
all
a
would have been killed,
chance.
except that he decided he was going to go in and make a difference, and he
Yeah.
did make a
And
difference.
it's gosh, it
And
would have
he's
been
another
easy
one
for
of
him to
those.
get killed in that
Yeah,
fight.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he was in a position while they had fuel inside these,
They're
wooden boxes,
stamping on
shooting at him.
the
Yeah,
bullets
shooting
as
at him
they're
with incendiaries, and again, a person who had the stature that he didn't have to be there. He chose to be there, and again, a person at the end of his life when he had a very distinguished career, and including Academy Award nominations. When he was asked later in life, what are you most proud of, it was this. But he was also clearly still very much haunted by recovering those bodies there too. I mean, that spectacle there of all those Marines just floating that were killed before they could even pull their guns out, killed before they could even get to shore.
Those opposed landings when the defenses are
it was, and the tide too, right? When they had to walk in waist deep or chest deep in water across this coral for hundreds of yards while being swept by machine gun fire, had to be absolutely horrifying to be there. And I don't know how you keep your head about you to go and be able to make the difference that he made. I kind of feel bad for the sniper that suddenly had 630 caliber machine guns shooting at him, but I mean, I guess
that's
there's a point where you're asking for it.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's you can just see how he's thinking that whole time through, and they changed their strategy, and they're doing this not from training, just because in the midst of the situation they rose to the occasion. And that's someone that's worthy of note any which way, even if he hadn't come out to become someone who was a household name. In his time.
He was. I mean, what he did in the war was heroic and worth remembering. I mean, he saved people's lives, and they were so often that you talk about how your plans don't last beyond contact with the enemy, and that's. I mean, this was an example where things started going wrong, and then you got to rely on honestly often your junior officers to
he was there in the moment. He rose to that occasion. In doing that, he saved numerous lives, and that's worthy of note. So I mean, the whole today we're really talking about these movie stars that had their role in World War II, but what they really do is because they became famous, they were able to sort of highlight the sacrifice. Because the thing about what he did there at Tarawa is that was thousands and thousands of times other officers in combat in different places did the same thing, and I don't know that we can really understand today what they were asked to sacrifice there, and you're right. We haven't had anything since the Second World War that was really anything like the Second War.
And we couldn't possibly tell every story of heroism, and we've certainly told many of them, but there's just always more, and I think that this is a good example of that. And we talk about all these other people who were involved in this battle that would essentially be forgotten, was remembered at the time, was shocking at the time, and which is essentially is a battle no one talks about anymore, over a fight for a tiny little strip of
tiny little half square mile atoll.
Crazy. And this, I mean, all of the people who lost their lives there and who participated in that, I mean, they deserve to be remembered, and he's a part of that story.
Well, and also this is an example too of how tenacious the Japanese were. You have to have respect for their willingness, so wildly outnumbered, to fight to the death, the sacrifice. There in
some ways, this is very similar to Iwo Jima in terms of the determined defense and the just the entire garrison is killed, essentially, almost to the last man at that point, and that was I mean, at Iwo Jima, there's some question over whether that battle was necessary or not, and whether it accomplished what we wanted it. But they also thought
it's certainly easy to look back and say war stinks, right?
Oh yeah, I mean that's just.
But you have to admire these people fighting for a cause on both sides of that in this horrible situation, and also the way that some of them rose to that situation to save the lives of others. It's all around. I mean, just people sometimes will be upset that we talk about war, and of course, the history guy, we talk about all sorts of things. But I mean, war is a human endeavor, and it is one that brings out the best and the worst, and it certainly represents the most powerful of human emotions. And so I don't like war. I wouldn't want to be in a war. I hope we don't have to fight wars, but it doesn't mean that I don't believe that the people who in this extraordinary time, face this extraordinary situation, don't deserve to be remembered. Obviously they do. And I think most of us can sit around today and say, in the same situation, could I have made that difference? I don't know. And luckily, I mean, just by great blessing, don't have to actually answer that question, because people like Edward Heimberger did. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten History, and if you did, you can find more on our website, thehistoryguy.com. We release podcasts every 2 weeks, so stick around if you want to hear more podcasts of Forgotten History. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. You can even get a personalized message from the History Guy himself on Cameo.